Hello, everyone, and welcome back. It's been way too long for a new season of Life with GDPR. As always, joined by my good friend and colleague, Jonathan Armstrong. Jonathan, welcome back.
Thanks very much, Tom.
Jonathan, we had some pretty significant news out of the United Kingdom Ministry of Justice this week about something called failure to prevent. So, what are we trying to prevent, and how do we do it?
Yeah, thanks again, Tom, for the introduction. I think this is tangentially relevant to GDPR, but let me explain why. One of the biggest conflicts we've had in the compliance world when GDPR came in was that conflict between bribery and investigations and GDPR. And that's often where the rubber hits the road because an organization wants to investigate wrongdoing, and quite often the wrongdoer doesn't want to be investigated. So we get cases that we've talked about on the podcast before, like some of the Russian oligarch cases, where the individual under investigation tries to use GDPR rights either to stop the investigation happening or for a real-time commentary into the investigation of their behavior. And obviously, there's those conflicts there between the potential for high fines under bribery law, let's say, if you don't investigate, and the potential for high fines under GDPR if you do and you get it wrong. And that game, if you like, has, I think, intensified with the passing of the UK amendments, if you like, to fraud legislation. And we've been waiting for a while for official guidance on the failure to prevent provision. Now, for those people who are familiar with the 2010 UK Bribery Act, they'll know that there's an offence of failure to prevent bribery. So if an act of bribery occurs, then it is assumed that the company should have prevented it and didn't. That's a separate offence under Section 7. There's a defence if you took reasonable measures to prevent the bribery. But other than that, you can be guilty under Section 7. There's all sorts of academic debate over whether that's a reversed burden of proof in the strictest sense or not. But the organisation has to show that it took appropriate measures to try and stamp out bribery. And we've got almost the same regime coming in now with failure to prevent fraud. Now, the UK has been concerned, just as it is with bribery, that fraud is fairly prevalent. And the governments of both flavours have wanted to do what they could to try and increase the obligations on organisations. And just as we had the Section 7 guidance for the Bribery Act coming in 2011, then this is similar guidance that shows organizations what they should be doing to try and stamp out fraud. And if they do, then they can be guilty of this new offense. So as some avid listeners will know, in the UK, acts become law when the king signs them off. And he signed that off on the 26th of October last year. And this guidance follows and paves the way for the failure to prevent fraud offense to become law. And it doesn't apply to every business. It applies to what are called large incorporated bodies and partnerships. And there are definitions in the legislation as to what that means in practice. But in reality, we're looking at organizations with more than 250 employees, or more than 36 million in turnover, or more than 18 million, these are sterling amounts, in total assets. And you effectively, it's a little bit like one of those old-fashioned quizzes. If 2 out of those 3 apply, then you come within the legislation. So organizations have to adopt measures to try and stamp out fraud. They're similar in many respects to the failure to prevent bribery provisions. We've got 6 principles there. And again, maybe the last thing to say is, of course, non-UK businesses can be in scope. just as we've seen in the bribery legislation, non-UK entities receive fines like Airbus, for example, which is a strange hybrid corporation in terms of its jurisdiction. We have also seen US corporations be subject to Bribery Act investigations. And I think we can expect the same with these new fraud offences, particularly when they are UK subsidiaries of a US corporation. I think we're likely to see an impact there. So, in practical terms, organizations need to look at what might be reasonable procedures. They need to do a gap analysis versus that and their existing procedures and try and improve ready for the changes to come in. There's a slight lack of clarity as to the exact date that the new provisions will come in. We expect that to be resolved in the next few days, but I would target compliance by the end of July 2025. So ideally, people will have their programs ready by the summer and be able to demonstrate that they've done all they could to stamp out fraud by then. I can't hear you, Tom.
Really helps if you unmute your microphone marginally. Jonathan, could we go into the weeds just for a minute by taking a look at what constitutes reasonable procedures under the Failure to Prevent Fraud Act? And I think they're going to be very recognizable to any compliance professional listening to this, but I think it's worth sort of reiterating what the regulators see, or at least the legislators see, as some of the key procedures that a company should utilize to prevent fraud. So could you just maybe go through those and give us a comment or two on each one of them?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. And like you say, they're going to be very familiar to people who are familiar with this podcast and are familiar with either DOJ rules or MOJ rules in connection with bribery. The first one is top level commitment. So we talk so often, don't we, on everything compliance as well, about turn from the top and how that's important. And that has to be heartfelt. The worst example I've maybe discussed before is I was asked to review a film that a CEO had made to start off the corporation's ethics and compliance training. And he rather passionately said, I want everyone to listen. I want you to mark my words. I feel it in the heart. Do the right thing. That message was spoilt somewhat by, if you looked at the reflection behind his head, you could see colleague or associate holding up flashcards, which he even said, I feel it in my heart, open square brackets, Pat heart, close square brackets. So this has to be an authentic message, an authentic direction from the top, and that has to set the base level. And often organizations will have this struggle between the perception that the CEO and senior management only give messaging about hitting numbers rather than hitting numbers that are proper numbers that are justified. So often the issue with fraud is it's an operative who feels under pressure to make his numbers and he commits fraud to hit them. That's why top level commitment is important. The second principle is that risk assessment has to be done. That has to be dynamic. That's not a one and done process. So organizations will have to keep looking at their risks. And obviously they can change if they adopt a different business model, for example, with M&A activity, if they're going to new markets, if they're going to new products, if they have a different way of selling through channels, for example. It's important to remember that there are sort of associated person-like obligations in UK law as well. Organizations are going to have to do that risk analysis, but also keep it dynamic and look at redoing the analysis when circumstances change. They have to have proportionate procedures, again, allied to that risk. For example, if you're looking at checking transactions, for example, it might be more appropriate to do bigger checks in those parts of your organization which are at bigger risk. Similarly, due diligence, you could look at a factor that looks at the prevalence of fraud and then adapt your due diligence process accordingly, in the same way that some people do looking at bribery risk, where they'll use the corruption perception index, for example, to assess risk and have proportionate measures there. Fourthly, you look at due diligence. I've mentioned it already. That's going to be due diligence in those that we're dealing with and those that we're using. So sales agents, for example, are always an area of high risk, and we have to check them accordingly. The fifth principle is communication, so that we have to have good policies and processes. They have to be written in language that people can understand. Those that are overly legalistic are not going to find favor. We have to take into account the fact that if we're a multinational organization, the first language, some of our employees will not be English. So we have to make sure that we use the right tone of voice for those individuals. We have to make sure that those policies and procedures are communicated and understood throughout the organization. And then the sixth bit is about monitoring and review. It's a little bit like the system with a traffic control, where we not only have to make sure that our procedures are fit for purpose, but if we have an incident or a near miss, we have to look at learnings, review those procedures, adapt where necessary, and improve. Those six principles, as you say, relatively common in other areas as well, but a useful, I think, reinforcement of what corporations are expected to do. And as I said, it's almost, I'm cautious of using the words, but it's almost like a reversed burden. If there is an element of fraud in your organization, then you will have to prove that you took all the right measures to stop that happening. That'll always be a high hurdle to jump, given that the event has happened.
Can't you just call it an affirmative defense? Does that
I think
concept exist in English law?
I, I don't think it does in those terms. I think there's all sorts of academic debate. I know when I was at law school on things like shifting burdens, and I think it's probably one of those technically, but I think we can perhaps get too legalistic about it. I think the easiest way of looking at it is that once the act occurs, then the hot potato switches to the company to try and show that it did all it can to stop things happening.
Okay. Let's take it a little bit different direction. You and I have visited literally since the Bribery Act of 2010 about
Yeah.
some of the defenses under the Bribery Act and talked at length about those. As you went through the list, of course, many of our listeners will recognize those from the Bribery Act as well. How far is fraud really in your mind from bribery? And I'm trying to get at, if a compliance professional has an anti-corruption compliance program in place, can't they adapt that rather, maybe not easily, but at least adapt their anti-corruption program over to their fraud prevention program?
Yeah, I think for many corporations, I think that will be a decent place to start. And I think there are clearly similarities in the guidance. If organizations have procedures in place to meet their Bribery Act obligations, then then I think you can do that carry across. Of course, if you've got no processes in place to stop bribery, then you're in a bad place. And sometimes the same employee, the same agent, does both acts as part of the same transaction. So oftentimes, for example, there will be, for example, getting a pot of money to a foreign agent by allowing him to overinflate his invoices, which then gets a sort of fighting fund in the agent's bank accounts, which is then used to create a bribe paying pot. So in cases like that, there's obviously bribery offences because you've used the money to pay either a private individual or a public official. Doesn't matter under UK law that much. Private to private briberies still within the scope of the Act. So you've got that pot of money to pay somebody off, but you've procured the pot of money by fraud, by overinflating the invoices and paying them. So it's easy to see that in some cases, we'll have both the failure to prevent fraud and the failure to prevent bribery provisions engaged. So that's why it might be useful to do some of these things in tandem. Training, for example, I think many organizations will want to refresh their training and they'll want to train on fraud and bribery, perhaps at the same time.
And Jonathan, could I maybe ask you to conclude this podcast by maybe giving a few steps you think compliance professionals should take now, or at least prior to September 1 of 2025?
Yeah, I think the time is short given the speed at which many organizations act. I think they've got to do a gap analysis now. Where I'd be starting is I'd be starting by looking at policies and procedures. Are they fit for purpose? Do they need adapting? It might be an FCA policy that people use with a Bribery Act rider, but in any event, it's probably time to refresh that, simplify the language if you can, try and make sure that it's still fit for purpose. I would secondly be looking at training, I think, and that's training not only the foot soldiers, if you like, but senior management and the board as well. It might be appropriate to train them differently. But one of the things that we're seeing in many cases is this whole CEO risk scenario. And we've talked about it before, where organizations are getting better at training those from the compliance officer down, but are struggling more with training compliance officer up. And as we said, things like turn at the top are very important here. So we'll need to make sure that the board, the CEO, senior management are bought into this and are living and breathing their responsibilities here. And then I would probably be looking at helplines, investigation protocols, and things like that as well, so that we can make sure that that bit of the organization is tuned into risk and is able to identify and triage issues quickly so that we can investigate them and so that we can try and deal with things appropriately. It might be appropriate to deal with something before the new provisions come in if there's some latent issues in the organization. But again, that'll be very fact specific. But you certainly do need those antenna out there to try and pick up issues and spot them and deal with them quickly.
Jonathan, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. We're going to link to the law firm client alert on failure to prevent fraud. So our audience will have that resource as well as your contact information at the firm. I am relatively sure we'll be visiting on this topic again in the future.
I'm sure so as well. Yeah. Thanks for your time, Tom.